Sarah Calloway dropped the feed pail before she even reached the corral gate. It hit the frozen ground and rolled grain, scattering across the dirt, and she didn't move to pick it up. The mare on the other side of the fence, a red roan named Rosie, gentle as church on Sunday, everybody said so, had simply turned her head. Just turned it. And Sarah had gone cold from her scalp to the soles of her boots, every muscle in her body seizing at once, her breath leaving her in a single thin strip of sound that wasn't quite a word and wasn't quite a scream. She pressed her back against the barn wall and could not make herself move. 32 years old. She was 32 years old, and a horse had looked at her, and she had come apart at the seams. This was Wyoming. This was her marriage. This was her life now. God help her. If this story already has your heart, I want you to subscribe to this channel right now. Hit that button before you forget and follow Sarah all the way to the end, because I promise you where she ends up will surprise you. And drop a comment below telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to Wyoming. The letter from her aunt in Boston had called Preston Hale a steady man with good land and honest intentions. It had not mentioned the horses. It had not mentioned 40 of them. Sarah had stepped off the stage in Laramie on a Tuesday morning in October of 1883, her traveling trunk strapped to the back, her good gloves already splitting at the thumb seam from how tightly she'd gripped the door handle for the last 3 miles of rutted road. Preston had been waiting at the depot. He was taller than she'd imagined from his letters, lean in the way of men who work rather than men who starve, with dark eyes that assessed her without apology, and a hat brim pulled low against the wind. He'd said, "Miss Calloway, I'm glad you made it safe." She'd said, "Mr. Hale, thank you for the fare." They'd shaken hands, loaded her trunk, and driven 4 hours to the ranch without speaking more than a dozen words between them. That had been 3 weeks ago. In those 3 weeks, Sarah had learned to cook on a wood-burning stove that ran either too hot or too cold, and never anything in between. She'd learned to bank a fire at night and wake at 4 in the morning when the cold came through the walls hard enough to turn her breath to fog. She'd learned that Preston took his coffee black and his supper early and his sleep seriously, and that he was not a man who talked for the sake of talking, which she'd initially found respectful and had come to find something close to lonesome. She had not learned to go near the horses. It was Hattie Drummond, the woman from the neighboring spread, who came twice a week to help with the washing, who finally said it plain. She was a broad woman in her 50s, with forearms like ham hocks, and a directness that Sarah had come to appreciate even when it landed wrong. "You know," Hattie said, feeding a sheet through the wringer, "in 3 weeks, I ain't seen you so much as walk past that corral without crossing to the far side of the yard." "I've been busy getting the house in order," Sarah said. "House is in order." Hattie looked at her sideways. "Came in order 3 days after you arrived." Sarah kept her eyes on the washboard. "I'm not much for animals." "You're on a horse ranch, honey." "I'm aware." Hattie didn't push it, but Sarah felt the words settle on her like wet wool, heavy and uncomfortable, and she was still feeling them that afternoon when she went out to fill the feed pail and the mare turned her head and Sarah went to pieces against the barn wall. She was still there when Preston came around the corner. He stopped. He looked at her, at the spilled grain, at her white-knuckled hands, braced against the planking, at the way she was breathing in short pulls, like a woman who'd run a mile. He didn't say anything right away. That was something she'd noticed about him. He thought before he spoke, which had the effect of making every word he said feel considered, which sometimes felt like a gift and sometimes felt like a verdict. "You all right?" he said. "I'm fine." "You don't look fine." "I dropped the pail." He looked at the pail. He looked at Rosie, placid and indifferent on the other side of the fence. He looked back at Sarah. "She won't hurt you," he said. "I know that." Sarah pushed off the wall and brushed her skirt with hands that were still not quite steady. "I know she won't hurt me." "But you're afraid of her." She opened her mouth to deny it and then closed it again. There was something in his voice, not pity, not mockery, Just the flat acknowledgement of a thing that was true that made the denial feel small and pointless. "Yes," she said. "I'm afraid of her." Preston picked up the pail. He crouched down, scooped the scattered grain back in with his bare hand, stood up, and held the pail out to her. "How long?" he said. "How long what? How long have you been afraid of horses?" Sarah looked at the pail. She looked at Rosie. She took the pail from his hand. 17 years, she said. He didn't react the way she expected. He didn't ask why or look at her with that particular brand of careful sympathy that made her want to put a wall up. He just nodded slow, the way he nodded when he was turning something over in his mind. "All right," he said. "Come on then." "Come on where?" "Over to the fence." She looked at him. "Preston." "Not inside the corral, just to the fence." He was already walking easy and unhurried as though the matter were already settled. "Come on." She stood there for a moment, the pail heavy in her hand, and then she followed him because she didn't know what else to do. They stopped at the fence rail. Rosie had gone back to pulling at the hay in the corner, her tail switching once-twice. Up close, Sarah could see the individual hairs of her mane, the way her sides moved in and out with each breath, the massive fact of her 700 or 800 pounds of animal operating on its own logic, its own instincts, indifferent to what any human being needed or feared. "I can feel my heartbeat in my teeth," Sarah said. "I know," Preston said. "Keep standing there." "That's the advice, keep standing here. For today, yes." She exhaled. The cold air turned it to vapor. Rosie lifted her head and looked at them with one dark liquid eye, then went back to the hay. "Her name," Sarah said, because talking was easier than silence when her chest was doing what her chest was doing, "is Rosie." "Named her after my mother," Preston said. She glanced at him. "Your mother was called Rosie. Rose. She'd have hated Rosie, but I liked the sound of it on the ranch." Something moved briefly in his face, not quite a smile, not quite grief. "She died 6 years ago. Fever." "I'm sorry." "She was a good woman. Taught me horses before she taught me reading." He rested his forearms on the fence rail, relaxed as a man could be. "Said there wasn't a horse alive that was truly mean. Said some were just hurt enough to act like it." Sarah absorbed that. Rosie had turned toward them now, not approaching, just orienting. Sarah's hands tightened on the pail. "Keep breathing," Preston said quietly. "She can smell fear. But she can also smell that you're not running. That matters to her." "I want to run," Sarah said. "I know. But I'm not." "No," he said. "You're not." They stood there for another 5 minutes. Preston didn't speak again and didn't leave. Sarah's heartbeat came down degree by degree from the edge of panic to something that merely ached. When she finally stepped back from the fence, her legs felt thin and unreliable. "Same time tomorrow," Preston said. "You're serious?" "Every day," he said. "Just the fence, until the fence isn't the hard part anymore." She looked at him. This man she'd married out of letters and necessity, and a Boston apartment that felt like it was shrinking around her each year she got older. This man who said things like, "Your mother's horse can smell that you're not running," as if it were the most natural comfort in the world. "All right," she said. She went back to the house and sat down at the kitchen table, and didn't move for a long time. That night at supper, venison stew, cornbread, the same coffee he always took. "Black," Preston said without looking up from his bowl. "You want to tell me about the 17 years?" Sarah put her spoon down. "No," she said. He nodded. "All right." 3 minutes passed. The fire popped. Wind moved against the window glass. Outside, somewhere in the dark, one of the horses shifted in the barn, and the sound of it carried clear and close in the cold night air. "I was 15, Sarah said. Preston put his own spoon down. "My brother was 9, Thomas." She had not said his name aloud to another person in she could not remember how long. It felt strange in her mouth, like a word in a language she'd stopped speaking. "We were in Boston. Newbury Street coming back from my aunt's house. There was a delivery wagon. The horse was young, they said later. Barely broken. Something spooked it. A dog, I think. Maybe just the noise. She stopped. She looked at her hands. Thomas was standing between the wagon and the curb. I was on the other side of him. I grabbed for him. I got his sleeve. She stopped again. I didn't get enough. The kitchen was very quiet. It wasn't fast, she said. People always say it was fast. It wasn't fast. Preston didn't say he was sorry. He didn't say anything for a moment. Then he said, "How old were you?" 15. "And you've been carrying that since." My mother never blamed me outright, Sarah said, but I could see it in her face every time she looked at me after. I was there. I was older. I should have... She stopped herself. I moved to my aunt's at 17, worked at the dry goods store, answered your advertisement at 32. She picked up her spoon. There's the 17 years. Sarah. He said her name plainly with no extra weight on it, and that alone was somehow harder to bear than if he'd loaded it with feeling. You were 15 years old. I know what I was. Do you? He wasn't being unkind. He was asking a real question. Because it sounds to me like you've been telling yourself for 17 years that you should have been something other than 15. She had no answer to that. She ate the rest of her supper in silence, and so did he. And when she cleared the table, he stood up to dry the dishes without being asked. And she thought not for the first time that this man who said so little had a habit of saying the one true thing. The next morning she was at the fence when he came out of the barn. He looked at her. She looked at Rosie. Well, he said. Don't make it into something, she said. He didn't smile, but his voice came out warm. Wouldn't dream of it. She stood at the fence for 20 minutes that day. She stood for 25 the day after. On the fourth day, Rosie walked over to investigate, slow and incurious the way horses do, and Sarah felt the bottom drop out of her stomach and gripped the top fence rail so hard her knuckles went white. But she did not move. She stood there while Rosie lowered that great head over the rail and breathed horse breath, warm and grassy against her forearm. And Sarah stood there and let it happen. Good, Preston said softly from somewhere beside her. That's good. I might be sick, Sarah said. You're not going to be sick. I think I might. You're still standing. She was. She was still standing. Rosie pulled back after a moment, apparently having satisfied whatever curiosity she'd had, and returned to the middle of the corral. Sarah let out a breath that had apparently been waiting in her chest since Tuesday. I didn't die, she said. No. That's a low bar. It's where we start, Preston said. On the 6th day, Hattie came to do the washing, and found Sarah at the fence alone. No Preston in sight, talking to Rosie in a low, steady murmur, while Rosie stood on the other side of the rail with her eyes half closed. Hattie set down her basket and watched for a long moment. Well, I'll be, she said. Don't. Sarah said, not turning around. I didn't say a word. You were about to say several. Hattie picked up her basket and went to the wash house, and Sarah could hear her chuckling all the way across the yard. That afternoon, the new horse arrived. He came in on the back of a trader's wagon, a bay stallion 2 years old and wild-eyed as a storm, and the trader was a red-faced man named Gerber, who kept one boot on the wagon gate and one hand on a lead rope that the horse was making every effort to render irrelevant. Preston stood in the yard with his arms crossed, watching his jaw set in a way Sarah had already come to read as concentrated concern. Said he was broke, Preston said. He's broke, Gerber said. He's just... The horse lunged and the rope burned through Gerber's hands and he swore loud enough to clear the yard. Spirited. That ain't spirit, Preston said. That's terror. Sarah watched from the porch. The horse someone had apparently named him Phoenix, which she would have thought ridiculous if she hadn't been able to see the animal clearly enough to understand why was a beautiful ruined thing. Every line of him said, run, said danger, said, I do not trust a single thing in this yard, and I never will. His eyes showed white around the rims. His whole body was vibrating. "Preston," she said. "Go inside, Sarah." "I'm just saying." "I know what you're saying. Go inside." She went inside. She stood at the kitchen window and watched Preston take the lead rope from Gerber with the same careful hands he used for everything on this ranch. Deliberate, unhurried, like he had all the time in the world, and the horse was worth every minute of it. He didn't try to calm Phoenix down right away. He just held the rope and let the horse rage against it and waited. And waited. And slowly by inches, Phoenix's spinning slowed. His head dropped 6 inches, then another 6. Preston said something to him, Sarah couldn't hear what, and Phoenix's ears swiveled toward the sound. Gerber said something to Preston. Preston handed over some bills. The wagon drove away. It was just Preston and Phoenix in the yard now, and the afternoon light coming flat and gold across the frost on the ground, and Sarah watching from behind the glass, with her hand pressed flat against her own chest. She was still watching when Phoenix caught her scent from the window, or heard something, or was startled by something she couldn't see, and shied hard to the left. Preston moved with him, quick and balanced, keeping the rope from going taut, but the shift was enough. The fence post at the corner of the yard caught him across the back of the shoulder, and he went down. He went down hard. Sarah was already running. She burst through the back door and across the yard with no plan and no thought except that Preston was on the ground, and Phoenix was still moving, and the rope had gone loose. She hit the gate latch, got it open, didn't stop to think about whether this was the corral or the yard, or what a loose, terrified stallion would do to a woman who'd spent 17 years unable to approach a roan mare. She crossed the yard and dropped to her knees beside her husband in the dirt. "Preston." She got her hands on his face, turned it toward her. His eyes were open. "Preston, talk to me. I'm—" He drew a breath that caught somewhere in the middle of it. "I'm all right." "You went down." "Shoulder," he said. "Hit the post. I'm all right." He started to push himself up, and she pressed her hand against his chest and stopped him. "Don't," she said. "Don't move yet. Tell me where it hurts." "Sarah, tell me." He looked at her for a moment with those dark eyes. Then he said, "Shoulder. Maybe cracked something. I can't tell yet." Phoenix had backed himself against the far fence and stood there trembling wild-eyed, the loose rope dragging in the dirt. Sarah looked at him. She looked at Preston. She looked at the road that led into Laramie 4 hours away, the only road with the late afternoon light already going amber and the temperature already dropping. "We need the doctor," she said. "I'll ride in tomorrow." "You can't ride with a cracked shoulder." "I've ridden with worse." "Preston." She said his name the way he'd said hers, plain and direct, with no extra weight and no argument in it. Just truth. "I need to go get the doctor." He went quiet. He understood what she was saying. "Duke is in the south pasture," he said carefully. "He's the steadiest horse on this ranch. 16 years old. He'll do whatever you ask him." "I know," she said. "Sarah, tell me how to saddle him." He looked at her for a long time. His shoulder was clearly causing him pain. He wasn't advertising the lines around his mouth gone deep and tight. The cold was coming in fast off the mountains. "I'll talk you through it," he said. "Step by step." She stood up. Her hands were shaking, but they'd been shaking since she hit the gate latch, and she'd gotten through the gate anyway. "All right," Sarah Calloway Hale said. "Talk." Preston talked her through the saddle the way a man talks someone through something he knows will be harder than it sounds, steady, specific, leaving no room between the steps for fear to rush in and fill the gaps. "South pasture gate is the one with the red latch," he said. "Duke's the gray. He'll come to you. He always comes." "What if he doesn't?" "He will. Hold your hand out flat and just stand there. He'll come." Sarah walked to the south pasture with the bridle over her arm and the saddle blanket draped across both shoulders, and the late afternoon light making long shadows out of everything. She could hear Preston behind her moving slow toward the barn, refusing to stay down the way she'd told him to. She didn't turn around. If she turned around, she would go back to argue with him, and she couldn't afford to lose the time or the nerve. The gray horse was at the far end of the pasture. She climbed through the rails, not the gate. She couldn't get the latch. Her hands weren't reliable enough for latches right now, and she stood in the frost-stiffened grass and held her hand out flat, the way Preston had said. Duke lifted his head. "Come on," she said. Her voice came out smaller than she'd intended. She cleared her throat. "Come on, then. I know you don't know me. I barely know me right now, but I need you to come here." The horse looked at her with the profound, assessing calm of an animal that has seen considerable human foolishness and has developed patience around it. Then he walked toward her slow, and even his breath coming out in gray puffs in the cold air, and he put his nose against her outstretched palm, and she felt the warmth of it, and something in her chest cracked open like ice in March. "All right," she whispered. "All right. Good. That's good." She got the bridle on. It took 3 tries and 1 moment, where she had to press her forehead against Duke's neck and breathe deliberately until the shaking in her hands was manageable, but she got it on. She got the blanket across his back. She went back for the saddle, which was hanging on the fence where Preston had dragged it, before she could stop him, his face gone gray with the effort and the pain, and she lugged it to Duke, and she got it up on his back on the 2nd try. She could not get the cinch tight enough. She tried twice. The buckle kept slipping. Her fingers were cold and clumsy, and she was working on a horse. A living horse that she had to climb up onto, and ask to carry her 4 hours into Laramie and 4 hours back, and the buckle kept slipping. "Tuck your elbow," Preston said. She spun around. He was leaning against the fence rail, his left arm held against his chest, in a way that told her everything about where the pain was and how bad it had gotten in the last 10 minutes. He was pale under the tan. His jaw was doing that thing again. "Tuck your elbow into the strap and use your body weight," he said. "Not just your hands. You're supposed to be inside. And you're supposed to be afraid of horses." He said it without any particular emphasis. "Tuck your elbow." She turned back to Duke and tucked her elbow and used her weight, and the cinch tightened the way it was supposed to, the buckle seating itself cleanly, and she stood there for a moment with both hands braced against the saddle and her eyes closed. "Sarah." Preston's voice had changed, gone quieter. "You don't have to do this. We've been through this. I can make it to the Drummonds on foot. It's only 2 miles. With a cracked shoulder in dropping temperatures." She turned around and looked at him. "No. Then we wait until morning. And if it's not cracked, if something's broken clean through and you sleep wrong and it shifts." She had worked in a dry goods store in Boston for 15 years, and in that time she had seen 2 men come in broken from riding accidents, had heard the conversations that happened after, had watched one of them go back to work, and watched the other one not go anywhere anymore at all. "No," she said again. "Tell me how to mount." He looked at her for a long moment. His eyes moved over her face the way they sometimes did, reading something she didn't know she was writing. "Left foot in the stirrup," he said. "Push up and swing your right leg over. Don't think about it. Just do it in one movement." "Don't think about it," she repeated. "That's the one." She put her left foot in the stirrup. Duke stood perfectly still. She gripped the saddle horn with both hands, which Preston had told her not to do, and pushed up, and her right leg swung over, and then she was up. She was in the saddle. Duke shifted his weight slightly, adjusting to her, and she made a sound that was not a word, and gripped the reins and the saddle horn both. "You're up," Preston said. "I know I'm up." "You're doing fine." "I am not doing fine," she said quite distinctly. "I am doing it anyway, which is a different thing." Something moved in his face that she thought later might have been the beginning of something larger. But right then he just nodded and gave her the directions to the doctor's house in Laramie Drive. August Farley on the corner of 2nd and Main gray house with a blue door, and told her to keep Duke at an easy lope and not to push him faster than that, because the footing got uncertain past the first creek crossing, and Duke was 16 and didn't need the strain. "And if it gets dark before you get there?" she said. "Duke knows the road. Let him find it." "And if Sarah." He put one hand on her boot briefly, just the weight of it on the toe of her shoe. "You can do this." She looked down at him from the height of the saddle. This man who'd met her off a stage 3 weeks ago, and shaken her hand, and driven her 4 hours in silence. This man who'd picked up a spilled pail and handed it back, and stood beside her at a fence rail until her heartbeat came down. She thought of what Hattie had said. "You're on a horse ranch, honey." She thought of Thomas's sleeve in her hand on Newberry Street, and the one terrible moment when she'd understood it wasn't going to be enough. She thought about what Preston had said at supper. "You've been telling yourself you should have been something other than 15. She picked up the reins the way he'd shown her. "Behave yourself while I'm gone," she said. And she rode out of the south pasture gate and onto the Laramie Road as the sun touched the top of the mountains, and the temperature dropped another 5 degrees, and Duke's hooves found their rhythm on the cold, hard ground. The first mile was the worst. Every movement Duke made translated directly into Sarah's body, as pure animal panic, the shift of his weight through a turn, the small stumble over a rock, and recovery that took less than a second, the way his ears moved forward and back, tracking sounds she couldn't hear. Her hands were too tight on the reins. She knew they were too tight. Preston had told her about tight hands, told her it communicated fear down through the leather, to the bit, to the horse's mouth, and she could feel Duke responding to it, his stride shortening slightly, his own attention sharpening in a way that wasn't quite alarm, but wasn't quite comfortable either. She made herself loosen her grip. It was one of the hardest physical things she'd ever done, opening her fingers when everything in her was demanding she hold on tighter, and she did it degree by degree, finger by finger, until the reins rested in her palms instead of being strangled by them. Duke's stride evened out. His ears relaxed. He blew out a long breath through his nose and settled into a road lope that was smooth enough that Sarah's own breathing began after another quarter mile to follow it. In and out, in and out. Duke's rhythm, the cold air moving against her face, the mountains going purple in the last of the light. She thought about Preston getting himself to the barn, because she knew that's where he'd go, not inside like she'd told him not to sit down and rest his shoulder, but to the barn to check on Phoenix, because that was the kind of man he was. She thought about Phoenix in the barn, trembling against the wall, as wild-eyed and undone as Sarah herself had been that morning at the corral gate. Something his mother had said relayed through Preston there wasn't a horse alive that was truly mean. Some were just hurt enough to act like it. She wondered what had happened to Phoenix before the trader's wagon. She wondered, and then she stopped wondering, because wondering led to imagining, and imagining led places she couldn't afford to go on the back of a horse at dusk in Wyoming, with 4 hours between her and help. She rode. She crossed the first creek. Duke took it without hesitating, dropping down the bank and up the other side in 4 smooth strides, and she let out a sound she would not have described as a laugh, but that had something laughing in it somewhere. She rode through the section of road that ran between 2 bluffs where the wind came down off the rock faces and hit her sideways, and she leaned into it and stayed in the saddle. She rode through the dark that came on fully an hour out of the ranch, and she watched Duke's ears and let him navigate the footing the way Preston had told her to, and she held the reins in her loosened hands and breathed. She thought about Thomas. She hadn't let herself think about Thomas on horseback before, because she'd never been on a horse before, not since Newberry Street, not since the delivery wagon and the dog, and the sound that the street had made afterward, a sound she'd spent 17 years keeping at the edge of her hearing, never quite letting it come all the way in. She let it come in now. She didn't know why. Maybe it was the dark or the cold, or the fact that her body had been through so much in the last 2 hours that it had run out of energy to keep certain doors locked. Maybe it was Duke's steadiness under her, the simple animal fact of a creature she'd been terrified of carrying her through the dark without asking anything from her, but a light hand and a little patience. But she thought about Thomas, not just the moment on Newberry Street, not just the worst part, but Thomas himself. Thomas at 9 years old, who had been afraid of lightning until he wasn't, who had talked Sarah out of throwing away a baby bird she'd found hurt in the yard and had nursed it back to health in a box beside his bed. Thomas, who had been 9 and fearless in the way of children who haven't yet learned what fear costs. She hadn't let herself miss him in a long time. Missing him had always come attached to the guilt, the two of them tangled together so completely, she hadn't been able to find one without the other. But riding through the Wyoming dark with her hands loose on the reins, she found a pocket of something that was just grief, just loss, clean and undefended. She let herself cry for about a mile. Then she wiped her face on her sleeve and rode on. Laramie appeared as a smear of lamplight on the horizon, and then resolved itself by degrees into buildings and streets, and the noise of a town that was still working at 9 o'clock at night. Duke slowed to a walk without being asked when they hit the first street, his hooves loud on the frozen mud, and Sarah found 2nd and Main and the gray house with the blue door, and pulled up outside it and sat there for a moment in the saddle. She had ridden to Laramie. She was sitting on a horse in Laramie, Wyoming at 9 o'clock at night, having left the ranch alone at dusk, and she had not fallen, and she had not turned back, and she had not quite come apart. She got down off the horse the way Preston had described getting up in reverse. Left foot out of the stirrup, right leg swinging back, drop and land. She landed harder than she meant to, and her knees buckled, and she caught herself on the stirrup leather and stood there breathing against Duke's side. "Good boy," she said into his neck. Her voice had gone thick. Good boy." She tied him to the post and knocked on the blue door. Dr. August Farley was a short, precise man in his late 50s who had clearly been asleep, but who handled being woken with the practiced equanimity of a man who had been woken at 9 o'clock at night many times before. He took one look at Sarah, wind-burned, red-eyed dirt on her skirt from the corral, hands still slightly unsteady, and said, "How far?" "4 hours," she said. "My husband. Shoulder. He hit a fence post hard and went down. Possible fracture." "I think so. He said maybe cracked. She stopped. "He downplayed it. He does that." Farley was already getting his coat. "They all do," he said. "Give me 2 minutes." He came back in 90 seconds with his bag and his horse saddled, which meant he had a boy in the back who handled the horse, which meant Sarah had 2 minutes standing in the cold outside a stranger's door in Laramie, with nothing to do but feel everything she'd been holding off for the last 4 hours come rolling through her at once. She stood straight. She breathed. She felt it come through, and she let it, and she was still standing when Farley came back out. "You rode in alone," he said, looking at Duke. "Yes." He looked at her a moment with the appraising eye of a man who has been a doctor on the frontier long enough to know what it costs some people to do ordinary things. "Good," he said. "Lead on." She got back on Duke. It was easier the second time. Not easy. Nothing about being on a horse was easy for Sarah Calloway Hale, and she doubted it would be easy for a good while yet, but easier. Her hands found the right pressure faster. Her body moved with Duke's more naturally, like a conversation she was just beginning to learn the grammar of. Dr. Farley rode beside her and talked about nothing in particular. The weather, the state of the Laramie Road, a bull elk he'd seen near the creek crossing 2 weeks back. And Sarah answered in short sentences and was grateful for it, because the talking kept her from retreating too far inside herself. They were 3 miles from the ranch when Farley said without particular preamble, "First time on a horse in a while?" Sarah glanced at him. "Yes," she said. "Thought so." He wasn't unkind about it. "You've got good instincts. A lot of people tighten up when they're frightened and fight the horse the whole way. You were working with him." "Eventually," she said. "Eventually counts," he said. She thought about that for the rest of the ride in. When they came up the road to the ranch, there was a lantern burning in the barn window. Of course there was. Sarah handed Duke's reins to Farley and pushed the barn door open, and there was Preston sitting against the wall of the nearest stall with Phoenix's lead rope loose in his good hand, talking to the horse in that low, steady murmur she'd watched through the kitchen window. Phoenix was still against the opposite wall, still trembling, but his ears were tilted toward the sound of Preston's voice like they were the most important thing in the barn. Preston looked up when she came in. His face did something complicated and brief, and then it went back to the steady expression she'd come to read as his version of relief. "You made it," he said. "Did you think I wouldn't?" "No," he said. "I didn't think that." "Doctor." Farley came in behind her and crouched down beside Preston and started his examination, and Sarah stood in the barn doorway with the cold at her back and the lantern light in front of her, and Phoenix's eye found her across the stall, white-rimmed and wary, and she held his gaze and did not look away. Dr. Farley called it a fracture. "Not clean through," he said, "but enough a crack in the clavicle that would need 6 weeks of careful handling and a sling that Preston accepted with the expression of a man being handed something he found deeply personally offensive." "6 weeks," Preston said. "Minimum," Farley said. "I've got a ranch to run." "You've got a ranch to not run for 6 weeks." Farley wrapped the bandaging with the efficiency of a man who had delivered identical news to identical men many times before and had long since stopped expecting gratitude for it. "You can supervise. You can give directions. You can sit on a fence rail and tell other people what needs doing. What you cannot do is use that arm." "I can use my right arm." "Your right arm isn't the problem. Your right arm's welcome to work itself half to death like it always has." Farley tied off the bandage and stood up and looked at Preston with the flat professional patience of his trade. "The left arm rests. 6 weeks. You want to argue with me? Argue with your bones." Preston said nothing, which was his version of accepting a thing he didn't like. Sarah walked Farley out to his horse and paid him from the household money she'd been managing since her second week on the ranch, the ledger book Preston had handed her without fanfare or explanation, simply setting it on the kitchen table one morning with the words, "You'll make more sense of this than I do." She hadn't known what to make of that then. She thought she understood it a little better now. "He'll mend," Farley said, settling into the saddle. "They always do the ones who go down hard and get back up before you can tell them to stay down." He looked at her with that same appraising steadiness he'd turned on her in Laramie. "You did a good thing tonight, Mrs. Hale. A hard thing. Same difference sometimes." She watched him ride out and stood in the yard until the sound of his horse faded, and then she went back to the barn. Preston had not gone to the house. She hadn't expected him to. He was exactly where she'd left him, against the stall wall, the sling already irritating him by the set of his jaw, watching Phoenix across the barn with the patient attention of a man in no particular hurry. Phoenix had not moved far, but his ears were different, tilted forward now instead of pinned flat, his breathing slower, his feet still but not braced. Sarah sat down on the other side of the barn door, close enough to talk and far enough to give the horse no reason to recalculate. "You should sleep," she said. "So should you. I'm not the one with a fractured clavicle." "No," Preston said. "You're the one who rode 4 hours alone in the dark on a horse you've been afraid of since you were 15. He glanced at her sideways. "I think you're allowed to be tired." She was tired. She was tired in a way that went past the muscles and down into something deeper, the particular exhaustion of a person who has held a great deal of tension for a long time and released it all at once. She leaned her head back against the barn wall and looked at the lantern light moving on the ceiling. "What happened to him?" she said. "Before the traitor." Preston was quiet for a moment. "I don't know the full of it. Gerber wasn't offering details, and I wasn't paying for a story, I was paying for a horse." He shifted his position carefully, accommodating the sling. "But he's got old scarring on his left flank, behind the shoulder. Something put it there." "Rope," she said. "Wrong shape for rope." He said it simply, not dramatically, just one more piece of the observable world. Wrong shape for most things I'd want to put a name to. Sarah looked at Phoenix. Phoenix looked back at her, that one white-rimmed eye finding her across the distance between them. She thought about what it was to be an animal with no language for what had happened to you. Nothing to do with the fear except carry it in your body and act from it and be called difficult, be called spirited, be called a problem horse when what you were was a creature with a very good memory and excellent reasons for every response you had. She understood that better than she wanted to. "Go to the house, Preston," she said. "I'll sit with him a while." He looked at her. "I'm not going to do anything stupid," she said. "I'm just going to sit here, like you were doing." "He's unpredictable," Preston said carefully. "He doesn't know you yet." "I know." She met his eyes. "I know he doesn't. I'm just going to sit here." Preston studied her for another moment, and then slowly, he got himself up off the floor, a process that cost him something he didn't advertise, and he handed her the loose end of the lead rope that was clipped to Phoenix's halter running through the slats of the stall. "If he goes sideways," Preston said, "drop the rope. Don't hold it. Just drop it and get to the door." "All right." "Sarah, I heard you. Drop the rope. Get to the door." He held her gaze for one more second, and then he left his bootsteps crossing the yard, and then the porch and the house door opening and closing, and the night going quiet again, except for the horses breathing, and the wind at the barn eaves, and the small sounds of the lantern. Phoenix watched the door where Preston had been. "He'll be back in the morning," Sarah said. "He's not going far." Phoenix's ear moved toward her voice. Not toward her, toward the sound of her. That was enough. She sat with him for an hour. She did not approach him. She did not try to calm him with anything except her voice, which she used, the way Preston used his low, steady, not asking for anything, just present. She talked about Boston, which she'd never intended to do. She talked about the dry goods store, and the smell of the bolts of fabric, and the way the winter light came through the front window in January flat and thin and blue. She talked about the apartment she'd shared with her aunt on Beacon Street, the radiator that clanged, and the neighbor's cat that sat on the landing. She talked about Thomas, briefly his name, what he'd looked like, the baby bird in the box beside his bed. And her voice only caught once, and she steadied it and kept going. Phoenix moved 6 inches closer to her side of the barn by the time she finally got up. 6 inches. She would take it. The weeks that followed were the strangest of Sarah's life, and Sarah had had some strange weeks. Preston ran the ranch from the kitchen table and the fence rails, and on his worst days from a chair, he had Hattie drag out to the yard so he could see what was happening without actually being foolish enough to walk out there and do it himself. He gave directions to the 2 ranch hands, Clem, who was 22, and eager in the way of young men who haven't yet been thoroughly disappointed by the world, and an older man, everyone called simply Wick, who communicated primarily through the angle of his hat brim, and he managed the accounts that Sarah brought to him in the evenings, and they went through together her reading numbers aloud, and him making decisions, and her writing them down. "You're faster at the additions than I am," he said one evening watching her work. "I've been doing figures since I was 12, she said. "My aunt kept the household accounts, and she taught me because she said a woman who can't read a ledger is a woman who can be robbed." Smart woman. Very. Sarah made a notation in the margin. She also said a woman who moves to Wyoming on the strength of 6 letters and a photograph deserves whatever she gets. Preston was quiet for a moment. "And what does she think you got?" Sarah looked up from the ledger. Preston was watching her with the direct, unhurried attention she'd gotten used to, without realizing she was getting used to it. "She hasn't asked yet," Sarah said. "She's waiting for me to write first." She looked back down at the numbers. "I haven't written yet." She went to Phoenix every day. She didn't push it. She sat on the same side of the barn on the same upturned bucket, and she talked, or she didn't talk, and she let him figure out the distance between them on his own schedule. On the 4th day, he came close enough that she could see the texture of his coat in the lantern light. On the 6th day, he put his nose toward her hand, the same thing Rosie had done over the fence rail, what felt like a different lifetime ago, and she held her hand out flat and let him sniff at it, and did not move. "There you are," she said quietly. "There you are." On the 9th day, she touched him. Just her palm flat against his nose for about 4 seconds before he pulled back. She did not make anything of it, did not go looking for Preston to report. It did not treat it as a milestone to be celebrated, because she understood instinctively that making a great deal of Phoenix's progress would somehow diminish it, the way explaining a joke in too much detail kills the thing that made it live. She told Hattie, though. She told Hattie one morning over the washing quietly as though she were reporting something minor. Hattie stopped the ringer. "You touched Phoenix," she said. Briefly. "Sarah Hale." Hattie looked at her with an expression that had several things in it at once. "3 weeks ago, you were turning white at the sight of Rosie through a fence." "I know." "That horse put your husband on the ground." "I know that too." Hattie shook her head and went back to the ringer. But Sarah could hear something in the older woman's silence that felt like respect, and she found she was not unaffected by it. Clem, who had been watching all of this from a respectful distance because Clem was 22 and perceptive enough to know when adults were managing things that weren't his business, came to Sarah one afternoon in the barn with his hat in his hands and said, "Begging your pardon, Mrs. Hale, but Wick and me was wondering if maybe you'd want to start learning the feeding routine proper, since Mr. Hale's in the sling and all." Sarah looked at him. He was a young man with an honest face and the permanently sunburned neck of someone who worked outdoors, and he was offering her something with that question, not a task, but a place. "Show me," she said. Clem showed her. Wick showed her in his way, which involved doing something in front of her once, and then tilting his hat a certain direction when she did it right, which she came to understand was high praise. She learned to measure the grain and to check the water troughs for ice in the mornings, and to read the small signals that each horse gave about its mood and its needs. She was not good at it, not yet. But she got better each day, which was what mattered. Preston watched her from the fence when he could, and said nothing, which was his version of everything. It was on a Wednesday, the 3rd week of his recovery, that the incident with Phoenix happened. Sarah had gone out to the barn in the early morning before Clem and Wick arrived because she'd gotten into the habit of giving Phoenix the first quiet hour of the day before the yard got busy. She had the grain bucket. She knew his feeding routine, now knew the way he held himself when he was calm versus when something in the air or the light had set him off. He was set off that morning. She could see it from the barn door, the tight circle he was making in the stall, his tail switching his ears back in a way that was different from his usual guarded alertness. She should have gone to get Clem. She knew that. She had been told more than once by more than one person that a horse in that kind of state was not a horse for a woman 10 weeks into her relationship with horses to handle alone. She stood in the barn doorway and watched him and thought about what she knew. She knew he had scarring on his left flank. She knew that the mornings were harder for him than the evenings, that something about the quality of early light in Wyoming triggered something in him that later in the day settled down. She knew that her voice steadied him more reliably than anything except Preston's voice, because she had sat with him enough mornings to have built incrementally something that was not yet trust, but was pointing in that direction. She went in. She didn't go into the stall. She stood outside it and set the grain bucket down and started talking the same low, steady murmur she'd been building for 3 weeks. And Phoenix made 2 more tight circles and then pulled up short and looked at her. "I know," she said. "I know. Whatever's got you, I know it feels like it isn't going to stop." She kept her voice even. Not soothing, not placating, just present, just there. The way she'd learned presence was different from placation. "But it's just the morning. The morning's always the worst part. And then it gets easier." Phoenix stopped circling. "It gets easier," she said again. "I'm not telling you it stops. I'm telling you it gets easier." He stood with his sides heaving, his breathing ragged, his eye on her. And then, by inches, by degrees, the way a thing under pressure releases, when the right place is found, he came down. His head dropped. His tail stopped switching. He let out a long breath that shook through his whole body. Sarah reached through the stall slats and picked up the grain bucket and set it inside. He ate. She was still standing there, hands slightly unsteady, when Preston's voice came from behind her. "How long was he like that?" She turned. He was in the barn doorway in the gray morning light, the sling making him look lopsided in a way that she'd stopped noticing weeks ago, except in moments like this when she saw him from a new angle. "Maybe 10 minutes before I came in," she said. "Less than 5 after." He looked at Phoenix, eating quietly now, and then he looked at her. "You should have gotten Clem," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "But you didn't." "No." He looked at her for a long time. Not the way he'd looked at her when she'd arrived off the stage in Laramie, assessing and cautious. Something else. Something she didn't have a word for yet but felt along her sternum like the first warmth after a long cold. "Rosie did that in her first year," he said. "The morning spinning. I used to sit outside her stall for an hour before I'd go in." He crossed the barn and stood beside Sarah at the stall rail, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him in the cold morning air. "Took 3 months before she stopped. Did you ever figure out what caused it? No. Some things you just learn to be present for." He was looking at Phoenix. "Some things you don't get to understand. You just get to show up." Sarah looked at the side of his face, the line of his jaw, the set of his mouth, the way he was watching his horse with something that was closer to what she now recognized as love than anything she'd seen him show toward most things he owned. "Preston," she said. He turned his head. "I'm going to write to my aunt," she said. "This week. I'm going to write and tell her what I got." Something shifted in his expression, slow and careful, like an animal moving toward something it doesn't quite trust yet, but is willing to approach. "What are you going to tell her?" he said. Sarah looked back at Phoenix, standing quiet in his stall, his sides moving in and out in the slow rhythm of a creature that has, for this moment, found something close to peace. "The truth," she said. "I'm going to tell her the truth." She wrote the letter that Thursday evening at the kitchen table, while Preston sat across from her going through the month's accounts with his good hand and a stub of pencil. The fire was doing what it did in November, running too hot, then not hot enough, requiring adjustment every 20 minutes, and the wind was up outside working at the windows with the persistence of something that had all night and knew it. Her aunt's name was Clara. Clara Whitmore née Calloway, 61 years old. A woman who had raised 2 daughters alone after her husband died of a bad winter in 1869, and had not once in Sarah's memory described this as difficult. She simply described it as what had happened, and then described what she'd done about it, and those were the only 2 categories Clara Whitmore recognized: what happened and what you did about it. Sarah wrote, "Dear Aunt Clara, I am writing to tell you what I got." She stopped, looked at that sentence for a moment. "I got a ranch in Wyoming with 40 horses and a man who speaks in short sentences and means every one of them. I got a gray horse named Duke, who carried me 4 hours in the dark in October when I needed it. I got a barn and a stall and a horse named Phoenix, who is as frightened as I was and is learning the same as I am to be in a room with his own fear without letting it make all the decisions. I got a husband who told me I've been expecting myself to have been something other than 15 years old, and I have thought about that sentence every day since he said it. I am still thinking about it. I think Thomas would have liked Wyoming. I think he would have liked the horses especially. I am sorry it took me this long to be able to write that." She folded the letter and addressed the envelope and set it by the door to go out with Clem in the morning. Then she sat back down across from Preston and picked up the ledger, and neither of them said anything about it, which was the right thing. Preston got his sling off at the beginning of December. Dr. Farley rode out to do the examination, pressed and prodded, and had Preston move his arm in directions that made his jaw go tight, and then sat back and said, "Another 2 weeks." Preston looked at him. "The bone's knitting fine," Farley said patiently. "But fine isn't finished. 2 more weeks and then you can do what you like with it. 3 more days and you'll undo everything and we'll start over." 2 weeks, Preston said. You've been saying that word like it means something different each time. It doesn't. 2 weeks, Mr. Hale. Same number it was when I walked in. After Farley left, Preston stood in the yard for a moment, with the sling back on, and his expression doing something complicated and contained. Sarah, watching from the porch, had learned enough about his face by now to read the layers of it, the frustration on the surface, and underneath that the thing he didn't say, which was that 2 more weeks of watching his ranch be managed by other people cost him something he didn't have a word for either. She came down the porch steps and stood beside him. "Clem and Wick have it," she said. "You know they have it. I know they have it. And I have the books. I know you have the books." He looked sideways at her. "You've reorganized the entire ledger system since October. The previous system was a testament to optimism over organization. I've been using that system for 11 years. "I know," she said. 11 years of optimism. It's impressive, really." The corner of his mouth moved. Not a smile exactly. Preston didn't smile the way other men smiled broadly and immediately, but a movement that carried everything a smile would have and delivered it in a more economical form. She'd come to value that economy. She'd come to look for it. She went back inside, and he went to the fence to watch Clem work the young horses in the far paddock, which he'd been doing every day of his recovery, standing at the fence with his good arm resting on the rail, watching, not interfering. Occasionally, calling out a single word of direction that Clem would receive and apply, with the grateful precision of a young man who knows he's learning from someone worth learning from. Sarah watched him through the kitchen window. She watched him the way she'd watched him that first day with Phoenix in the yard through glass from a distance, making sense of someone she was still in the early stages of understanding. She had married him out of letters and necessity, and the growing sense that a life lived inside 4 walls in Boston was not a life she could sustain much longer. She had not expected to find him interesting. She had not expected to find him kind, which was different from gentle, which was different again from easy. Preston Hale was not easy. He had opinions, and he held them, and he didn't apologize for them, and he expected a level of competence from the people around him that could feel like pressure when you were new to it, and had come to feel to Sarah like respect. He expected the same of himself, which was why the sling was killing him by degrees. The letter from Clara arrived 2 weeks later, which was fast even for Clara, who wrote the way she did everything efficiently and without wasted motion. Sarah. I got your letter on Monday, and I've read it 4 times, which I'm telling you, because I want you to know what it did to me. I'm not a woman who reads a letter 4 times. Your father read your brother's name and had to sit down. We have not spoken Thomas's name in this house in 11 years. I want you to know that. I want you to know that you broke something open that needed breaking. Your husband sounds like a man who knows how to wait. In my experience, this is the rarest thing in a man and the most valuable. Don't let him go. The horses will be fine. You were always braver than you knew. You just needed something worth being brave for. Sarah read the letter twice at the kitchen table, and then folded it and put it in the pocket of her apron and went out to the barn. Phoenix had started coming to her at the stall door by mid-November. Not every time there were mornings where whatever lived in him that was still wild and still frightened told him to stay back, and on those mornings she honored it, sitting on her bucket and talking until things shifted. But most mornings now, he was at the door before she got the bucket inside his ears, forward. His eye on her with an expression she had stopped trying to interpret and started simply receiving. She gave him the grain. She put her hand on his nose, and he held still for it. She scratched slowly behind his ear, which he'd started tolerating 2 weeks ago, and seemed by gradual degrees to be developing a position on. His eye half closed. Clara thinks you'll be fine, she told him, for what that's worth. She's a woman who's been right about most things. Phoenix leaned into the scratch slightly. An inch, maybe. An inch was significant. It was Hattie who said it first, the way Hattie always said the thing first. She came on her usual Tuesday, the 2nd week of December, and found Sarah in the paddock doing what Clem had been showing her, working Phoenix on a long lead, walking him in wide circles, asking him to change direction with pressure and release the basic vocabulary of a conversation between a person and a horse. Phoenix was not easy on the lead. He was still prone to sudden decisions about where he wanted to be that had nothing to do with where Sarah was asking him to go. But he was listening more than he wasn't, which was progress, and Sarah had learned to feel the difference in the rope between a horse who had checked out entirely and a horse who was arguing. Hattie leaned on the paddock fence and watched for 5 minutes before she said anything. "You know," she said, "you look like you've been doing this all your life." Sarah didn't look up from Phoenix. "I look like someone trying very hard not to fall down." "Same thing sometimes." Hattie set down her basket. "He's different from when he came." "He's still frightened." "He's less frightened." Sarah brought Phoenix around on a change of direction, giving with the rope, as he moved through it, taking it up again as he settled. "Aren't we all?" she said. Hattie made a sound that was not quite a laugh, and not quite agreement, but contained both. That evening, Preston's sling came off for good. Farley had said 2 weeks and 2 weeks it had been, and Preston received the news with the contained relief of a man who has been patient about something that required every ounce of patience he possessed. He moved his shoulder in careful circles. He opened and closed his left hand. He picked up a fence post that was leaning against the barn wall with both arms slowly testing and set it back down. "Well," he said. "Well," Sarah said. He looked at his hands for a moment the way people look at things they've had to do without for a time and are recalibrating the ownership of. Then he looked up at her. "I want to show you something tomorrow morning," he said. "Show me what?" "Phoenix," he said. "Something I've been waiting until I had 2 arms to show you." She looked at him. "What?" "Something." "Tomorrow," he said, and went inside. She didn't sleep well. Not from anxiety exactly, or not only from anxiety, but from something adjacent to it, the particular wakefulness of a person waiting for a thing they can't yet name. She lay in the dark and listened to the Wyoming wind, and thought about Clara's letter in her apron pocket, and the way Phoenix had leaned into her hand in the barn, and the way Preston had said, "I'll teach you gently," in his 3rd letter to her, back in August in Boston, when they'd been building something out of paper and honesty, and the shared decision to try, had said it about the ranch, about the life, had meant all of it generally, and none of it specifically, and she had come to understand that he meant it most specifically about the things he'd never said it about, directly. In the morning she was in the barn before him, which had become her habit, and Phoenix came to the door, and she gave him the grain, and put her hand on his nose and said, "Something's happening today. I don't know what, but I think you're going to be fine." Phoenix regarded her with his dark eye. "I think we're both going to be fine," she amended. Preston came in at 6:30, with both arms working, and something in his bearing that was different, not quite lighter but fuller, the way a man moves when he has access to the full version of himself. He stopped at the stall and looked at Phoenix for a moment. Then he said, "How is he in the morning?" "Honestly." "Better than he was. Still hard sometimes. The light does something to him." Preston nodded. "I want to put a saddle on him today." Sarah went still. "He's never been saddled here." "I know." "You don't know what Gerber did with him. You don't know what saddling means to him." "No." Preston turned to look at her. "That's why I need you in here when I do it." She looked at him. "Me?" "You're the one he trusts," Preston said simply, as though this were an observable fact and not the most significant thing anyone had said to her in longer than she could immediately account for. "I can read him well enough, but he'll look to you when it gets hard. I need you to be the thing he looks to." Sarah looked at Phoenix. Phoenix looked back at her. "All right," she said. What followed was the most painstaking 40 minutes Sarah had ever spent standing still. Preston moved around Phoenix the way he moved around all his horses, without hurry, without apology, each movement deliberate, and preceded by enough telegraphing that the horse could track it. He put the blanket on first, just the blanket, and they stood there for 10 minutes while Phoenix processed the weight of it. His skin twitching, his breathing elevated his eye. Going to Sarah every 30 seconds with a question she couldn't fully answer but could at least witness. "Keep talking." Preston said quietly. About anything. She talked. She told Phoenix about the dry goods store on Newberry Street. She told him about Clara's apartment on Beacon Street and the radiator that clanged. She told him about the stage ride from Denver to Laramie, which had been brutal in the specific way of things that are also beautiful if you look at them from the right angle. The land opening up wider than anything she'd seen in her life, wider than she'd thought land could be, the sky, doing things no Boston sky had ever attempted. Phoenix's breathing slowed. Preston went for the saddle. The moment the leather touched his back, Phoenix moved not violently, not the way he'd moved the day he'd put Preston on the ground, but a sharp sideways step, his whole body saying no, saying not this, saying something that had nothing to do with Preston and everything to do with whatever had come before. Sarah moved with him, keeping herself in his sightline, keeping her voice going, keeping the thread between them intact. Easy, she said. Easy. It's just weight. It's just weight on your back. Nobody's asking you to carry anything you haven't carried before. You've just got to let it sit there. Preston's hands were steady on the saddle, not forcing it, not retreating, just maintaining contact. Phoenix moved again a smaller step. His skin twitched under the leather. It's all right, Sarah said. It's not like before. Nothing here is like before. I need you to feel that. I know you can feel it. Phoenix stopped moving. His sides heaved once, twice. Then he dropped his head, not fully, not the way he dropped it in his easiest moments, but partway, which was partway more than it had been 30 seconds ago. Preston cinched the saddle slowly. Phoenix's skin twitched, but his feet stayed still. When the cinch was set, Preston stepped back and they all three of them stood there in the barn, the saddle on the horse. Nobody moving, the morning light coming through the gaps in the barn boards in thin, bright lines. Good boy, Sarah said. Her voice had come out rough. She didn't try to fix it. Good boy. Preston looked at her over Phoenix's back. She looked at him. Yesterday, he said, not loudly, not with any particular drama. Clem asked me if you'd been around horses your whole life. He couldn't figure out when you'd learned to read them that well. He paused. I told him you'd been doing it about 6 weeks. Sarah felt something move in her chest, warm and complicated. What did he say? She asked. He said that explained why you weren't afraid of them. Preston's eyes were steady on her. I told him you were afraid of them every day. She looked at Phoenix, the saddle sitting quiet on his back. Now his breathing, even his eye half closed. That's different from letting the fear run everything, she said. Yes, Preston said. It is. He came around the horse and stood beside her, the way he'd stood beside her at Rosie's fence in October, close enough that the warmth of him reached her, and they looked at Phoenix together in the morning quiet, and Sarah felt for the first time since she'd stepped off that stage in Laramie that she was not standing at the edge of her own life looking in. She was in it. She was in the middle of it. And the middle of it was here. The saddle stayed on Phoenix for 2 hours that first day. They didn't ride him. That wasn't the point. The point was the saddle, the weight of it, the leather smell of it, the way it sat on his back while he stood in the barn, and learned that this particular thing was not the same as the other things, that this barn and these hands and this woman's voice were a different country from whatever country he'd been broken in. Preston left Sarah in the barn with him and went out to start working his shoulder back into the day's tasks, careful and incremental in the way Farley had told him to be, and in the way that he characteristically interpreted as slightly more than Farley had meant, but less than he'd have done if no one had said anything. Sarah sat on her bucket. Phoenix stood with the saddle on and his eye half closed, and by the end of the second hour, his head had dropped fully, his lower lip gone slack, and he was somewhere between awake and asleep in the particular way of horses who have decided, at least for now, that they are safe. Sarah looked at him for a long time. She thought about the woman who had pressed her back against a barn wall in October because a roan mare had turned her head. She thought about that woman's hands on the fence rail, white-knuckled, shaking. She thought about the grain pail on the frozen ground and the terrible smallness of that moment, 32 years old and undone by a horse looking at her. She did not feel sorry for that woman. She had thought she would eventually, that the distance between then and now would make October look embarrassing, make the fear look like something she should have been able to simply decide her way out of. But it didn't look like that. It looked like the only place she could have started from. You start where you are. You start with what you have. There is no other place to begin. She took the saddle off Phoenix herself. Preston had shown her how to do it properly, and she did it properly, and Phoenix stood still for the whole of it, and when she hung the saddle on the rail and turned back to him, he put his nose against her shoulder and breathed there for a moment, warm and even, before pulling back to see what she'd done with the grain bucket. "Mercenary," she told him. She gave him the grain. She wrote to Clara that evening about the saddle. She didn't make it into more than it was. She'd learned that from Preston. The value of plain description, the way a thing reported accurately carried its own weight, without needing anything added to it. She wrote, "We put a saddle on Phoenix today. He didn't like it. He accepted it anyway." I think that's how most worthwhile things go. Clara's response came back in 11 days. "You sound like Wyoming. I mean that as a compliment. Your father says to tell Preston he made a good choice." Sarah read that line twice. Then she folded the letter, put it with the first one in the small wooden box she kept in the bedroom, and went out to the barn. Christmas came to the Hale Ranch quietly the way most things came there. Hattie brought a pie. Clem and Wick stayed for supper, which was venison and potatoes, and the good bread Sarah had finally mastered in the third week of November, after 11 failed attempts that Preston had eaten without comment every time, which she had chosen to interpret as loyalty rather than indifference. Wick said the bread was good. This was the longest sentence Wick had spoken in Sarah's presence, and she received it accordingly. After supper, Preston brought out a bottle of whiskey he'd been keeping for a reason he didn't specify, and they sat around the kitchen table and Clem talked about his family in Colorado, and Hattie talked about the Christmas she'd spent 1 year in a sod house in Kansas with no wood for the fire, and 4 children and a husband who thought the whole situation was an adventure, and the telling of it was funnier than the living of it had probably been. And Sarah laughed genuinely. Laughed the kind that sits behind the sternum before it comes out, and caught Preston's eye across the table, and he was looking at her with that expression she still didn't have a full word for, the one that had been growing in his face since October by the same incremental degrees that Phoenix's trust had been growing degree by degree, day by day. After Clem and Wick left and Hattie had gone with her pie dish, Sarah washed the supper things and Preston dried them, and outside the snow was coming down for the first time that season, soft and without urgency, the kind of snow that doesn't announce itself, just arrives. "I should check on Phoenix," Sarah said. "I already did, an hour ago. He settled." "You went out without telling me. I didn't think I needed permission to check my own barn." She turned from the wash basin. He was leaning against the counter with the dish towel over his shoulder and his arms crossed, and his face was doing that economical thing that meant he was amused and was deciding how much of it to show. "You should have told me," she said. "I like to know how he is at night." "He's fine. He was sleeping standing up when I checked, which means he's comfortable, which means you've done something that 4 months ago I would not have predicted was possible." Sarah dried her hands. "What wouldn't you have predicted? That a woman who couldn't walk past Rosie's fence in October would have a traumatized stallion sleeping standing up in his stall by Christmas." He said it simply as fact. "I had some hopes. I didn't have that." She looked at him across the kitchen, this man with his dark eyes and his short sentences and his habit of telling the truth in the plainest terms available. "What did you have?" she said. He was quiet for a moment, turning the dish towel over in his hands. "Hope that you'd stay," he said. That was the main one. She had known that. She had understood it for a while, the way you understand something first in your body and then later in words. She had understood it the morning he'd talked her through saddling Duke. She had understood it in the way he handed back ledger books and got chairs dragged into the yard and stood at fences and waited, She had understood it in every short sentence that turned out when she held it up to the light to be carrying more than it appeared to carry. She crossed the kitchen and took the dish towel off his shoulder and folded it over the rack. "I'm staying," she said. He looked at her. "I'm not telling you that as news," she said. "I'm telling you because I want you to know that I know it. That it's not just circumstance anymore. It's not just what I have. It's what I want." She kept her voice steady. This was the most direct she'd been with him since the night she'd told him about Thomas, and that had felt like breaking something open, and this felt like the thing that could be built in the space where the breaking had been. "I want to be here. I want this ranch and these horses, and the ledger that was a testament to optimism. I want Hattie Drummond saying true things at me over the wash. I want—" She stopped. "What?" he said. Quiet. Not a question exactly. More like permission. "I want whatever this is," she said. "Whatever we're doing here. I want it on purpose." He looked at her for a long time with that dark, careful gaze. Then he reached up and put one hand against her face. The left hand, the one that had been broken, and healed the one that had learned something about patience in 6 weeks of a sling that he'd hated every day of. He held it there warm against her cheek, and she put her hand over his, and they stood in the kitchen on Christmas night, with the snow coming down outside, and the fire doing what it always did, and said nothing else, because nothing else was needed. She rode Phoenix for the first time in January. It was not the way the stories went in the books she'd read in Boston, the ones where the wild horse was conquered in a single dramatic moment, rearing against a sunset, the rider triumphant and suddenly free of everything that had troubled them before. It was not like that at all. It was cold, and her breath was making fog, and Preston was standing at the paddock rail with his arms crossed, and Clem was pretending not to watch from across the yard, and Phoenix was saddled and bridled, and doing the thing with his ear that meant he was paying close attention to something he hadn't yet categorized as safe. Sarah stood at his left shoulder with the reins in her hand. "All right," she said to him, and to herself, and to October, and to Thomas on Newberry Street, and to the woman who had pressed her back against a barn wall and could not move. "All right, let's go." She put her foot in the stirrup, and she went up. Phoenix moved under her immediately, not explosively, not the way he'd moved the day he'd put Preston on the ground, but a sharp, collected bounce of energy that traveled up through the saddle and into her body, and said clearly without malice, "I am not certain about this." She sat deep in the saddle, the way Preston had told her, pushing her weight down through her heels, breathing out, and she said, "I know. I'm not certain either. We're doing it anyway." Phoenix walked. He walked the way he did everything with attention and residual suspicion, and an ear always monitoring the world for the thing that might require him to reassess. But he walked. He carried her around the paddock in a wide circle, his stride choppy at first, and then by the third circuit beginning to even out, as something in both of them settled into the shared language of movement, weight balance, ask and give. By the fifth circuit, she had stopped gripping the saddle horn. By the eighth, she had dropped her shoulders. By the time she brought him to a stop at the gate, she was crying, which she hadn't expected, and she sat in the saddle for a moment with her face turned away from the rail so Preston wouldn't see, and then she decided that was the wrong call, and turned back around and didn't hide it. Preston was looking at her with an expression she finally had the word for. It had taken her since October, and it was worth the time. What was on his face was the specific look of a man watching someone he loves do something he always believed they could do. "Well," he said. "Don't make it into something," she said for the second time since she'd come to Wyoming. Except this time, she was crying when she said it, and her voice had no authority whatsoever. "I'm not making it into anything," he said. "I'm just standing here." "You're standing there making it into something." "Sarah." And his voice was warm, genuinely warm, the way it had been getting since Christmas, warming by degrees, like the land warming toward spring. "Get off the horse and come here." She got off the horse. Clem materialized as if from nowhere, and took Phoenix's reins with the studied casualness of a 22-year-old, who absolutely had not been watching the whole thing. Sarah walked to the fence rail, and Preston was there, and she put her arms around him, which she had not done before, not like this, not without occasion or practicality, just did it. Pressed her face into the front of his coat and held on. He put both arms around her. The left one healed and working, and the right one steady as it always was. He held on back. They stood there until Phoenix made an opinion known about the delay in removing his bridle. In February, a letter arrived from Clara that Sarah had not been expecting, because Clara did not write twice in a month as a rule, and this was Clara's second letter in 3 weeks. The handwriting on the envelope was different from Clara's usual, more careful, less efficient. And Sarah stood in the yard with the cold coming through her coat and looked at it for a moment before she opened it. Sarah, your father had a stroke on the 14th. He is alive. The doctor says he will likely stay that way, but his left side is affected, and he will need care that I cannot provide alone, and that your cousin Margaret has already indicated she is unable to provide. I am not writing to ask you to come home. I know what you have there. I am writing because you deserve to know, and because I think you deserve to make the choice yourself, rather than have it made for you by omission. He asked about you. 2 days after the stroke, when he could speak again. He asked if you were all right. Sarah read the letter twice in the yard, and then went inside and sat down at the kitchen table with it in both hands. The fire was running hot. She didn't adjust it. Preston came in from the barn an hour later and found her there. He looked at her face and looked at the letter and pulled out the chair across from her and sat down and waited. She told him. He listened the way he always listened all the way through, without filling in the spaces, without offering the next thing, before she'd finished saying the thing before it. When she was done, he said, "How long have you been estranged from him?" "I haven't been estranged exactly. We just after Thomas. We didn't know how to be in the same room anymore. I left for my aunt's, and we wrote at Christmas and birthdays, and that was what it was." She folded the letter along its creases. "He asked about me." "He did. That's more than I expected." She stopped. "That sounds cold." "It doesn't," Preston said. "It sounds like someone who had learned not to expect something and is recalibrating." She looked at him across the table. Outside the window, the February light was doing what February light did in Wyoming, coming in flat and white and honest, no warmth to it yet, but no pretense either, just light. "I want to write him," she said. "Then write him." "I don't know what to say." Preston was quiet for a moment. "You told Phoenix things you didn't know how to say," he said. "You talked to a horse in a barn for an hour about things you hadn't spoken aloud in 17 years. I don't think you don't know what to say. I think you know, and it scares you." She looked at the letter in her hands. "Yes," she said. "Most true things do," he said. She wrote to her father that evening. She wrote for 2 hours, draft after draft, and burned most of them in the stove, and the one she finally kept was not long. It said, "Father, I heard you asked about me. I am all right. Better than all right. I am the best I have been in 17 years, and I think you deserve to know that, and I think Thomas would be glad to hear it too. I hope you mend. I would like to write to you more regularly if you are willing. I think we have both been waiting a long time to start over, and I think we are running out of reasons not to." She sent it with Clem in the morning. Her father wrote back in 3 weeks. The handwriting was shaky on the left side and steady on the right, which told her something about where he was in his recovery and what he was willing to push through. It said simply, "Sarah, come when you can. There's no hurry, but come." She showed the letter to Preston. He read it once and handed it back. "Spring," she said. "When the snow breaks. A week, maybe 2. "I'll manage," he said. "I know you'll manage. You managed 6 weeks in a sling." She folded the letter. "I'm not asking permission." "I know you're not." And there was something in his voice. Not amusement, exactly, something larger than amusement. Something that had grown in him the same way everything had grown between them by degrees, by shared work, by the daily practice of two people deciding to try. "I'm just saying, I'll be here when you get back." She looked at him. This man who had met her off a stage and handed her a ledger and stood with her at a fence rail in October when standing at a fence rail was the hardest thing she'd ever done. This man who had talked her through saddling a horse in the cold while his shoulder was cracked. This man who had said simply, "You've been telling yourself you should have been something other than 15, and in doing so had handed her back something she hadn't known she'd been carrying long enough to put down. "I know you'll be here," she said. "That's the whole point." On the last day of February, Sarah saddled Phoenix herself, all of it blanket saddle bridle start to finish, beginning to end the way Clem had shown her, and Wick had confirmed with the tilt of his hat, and Preston had overseen with his arms on the fence rail and his mouth shut. Phoenix stood for the cinch, and stood for the bridle, and stood for the moment when she came around to his left side and put her foot in the stirrup. She went up. He walked. She rode him out of the paddock gate and down the road that ran along the south pasture, the same road she'd ridden in October on Duke, alone in the dark 4 hours to Laramie, and 4 hours back terrified every mile of it. The morning was cold and clear and still. Duke was in the south pasture and lifted his head as they passed, and Phoenix's ear swiveled toward him and swiveled back. The mountains were doing what they always did, standing there beyond the reach of any weather, permanent and ungovernable, and the land was open in every direction, the way it had been the day she'd come off the stage in Laramie and felt the size of it like a physical thing pressing against her chest. She felt it now, too. But it was not pressing against her anymore. She had learned to breathe inside it. She had learned the size of herself inside the size of it, and the two things had made their accommodation, and here was the result. A woman from Boston on a bay stallion in February in Wyoming, riding east into the morning with her hands loose on the reins and her shoulders down, and 17 years of a locked door finally open on its hinges. She thought about Thomas. She thought about his name in her father's shaky handwriting on the letter she hadn't opened yet. She thought about Preston at the fence rail, and Clara's letter in the wooden box, and Hattie saying, "You look like you've been doing this all your life." She thought about Phoenix under her, this animal that had been broken, and was not unbroken, would never be fully unbroken. She understood that now some things don't go back all the way. But was working, was carrying her through the morning, on feet that had learned to trust. She turned him around at the creek, and they rode home. Preston was at the paddock rail when she came back through the gate, both arms on the rail, watching her come in from the road with the morning light behind her. She pulled Phoenix to a halt, and they looked at each other across the paddock. This man and this woman who had built something out of letters and necessity and the daily decision to stay, and the thing they had built was real, was standing in the cold February air with its feet on Wyoming ground. Sarah Hale had come to this ranch afraid of everything she did not know, and she had stayed, and she had learned, and she had ridden through her own darkness to bring help to a man who needed it, and she had sat in a cold barn and talked to a broken horse until he remembered how to stand still, and she had written to her father after 17 years of silence and told him she was better than all right, and all of it every cold morning, and shaking hand and white-knuckled fence rail had led here to this paddock, to this man at the rail, to this horse, breathing beneath her. She had not conquered her fear. Fear did not get conquered. It got carried and worked with and refused the driver's seat, and slowly by the accumulation of every day. You got back on anyway. It became something you could live alongside, rather than something that lived you. She knew that now. She would keep knowing it. She rode Phoenix to the rail, and Preston took the bridle in his hand and looked up at her with those dark eyes, and she looked back at him, and between them was everything that had passed since October, and everything that was still coming, all the years of it, wide and open as Wyoming itself. Sarah Calloway. Hale had come west afraid, and she had stayed, and she had chosen, and she was not afraid anymore, not of the horses, not of this man, not of this life, not of the size of the land, or the length of the winters, or the woman she was still becoming. She had ridden through the dark to get here, and she had arrived, and this was home.